Hi, I'm Kristina. My background is in sports science and now finishing a PhD in sports medicine. I'm an exercise physiologist for Super Sapiens and working as a part of a science team of Super Sapiens. My main role is to give support to elite individual athletes, teams, and partners, and to oversee the lab and field research projects we're doing. You're listening to the Physical Performance Show, and I hope you're going to have a lot of fun with us today.
And the winner is...
Failure is not an option.
I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go.
Welcome to episode 350 of the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by Polar's stunning new generation running watches and their upcoming cyber sale and Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations. Now, big news for the show. At the time of this episode release, we are just several days away from the finals of the Australian Podcast Awards, where the Physical Performance Show has been nominated as a finalist for the Australian Best Sports Podcast category. So I want to say a massive thank you to everyone who has supported the show over the years, including our wonderful guests for their contribution. I'm Brad Beer, sports and exercise physiotherapist by trade and training and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. Of course, we do this across a range of different episodes, interest editions, expert editions, featured performers, learn-ins catch-up episodes, and coaches' corners. And on today's expert edition, we'll hear from medical doctor Howard Zisser and his Super Sapiens colleague Kristina Skroce, sports physiologist, around continuous glucose monitoring for health and performance. Now, back on episode 344, we featured Phil Sutherland, who shared the backstory of continuous glucose monitoring and the formation of Super Sapiens. Many of us will recognise the black discs now being worn on the back of the triceps of many of the planet's greatest endurance athletes, and that is the Super Sapiens CGM continuous glucose monitoring device. But off the back of the interest from episode 344, we wanted to dive deeper and take a look at how this technology and science has morphed from the world of healthcare over into performance. We also look ahead at what CGM may look like in the decade ahead for both healthcare and also sporting performance. So here is my conversation with Super Sapiens Kristina Skroce, sports physiologist, and Howard Zisser, medical doctor and chief scientific officer. Kristina, welcome to the Physical Performance Show. It, from all accounts, has been a whirlwind time for the team at Super Sapiens, coming off the back of the 2022 Ironman World Triathlon Championships, held literally only a matter of days ago in Kona, where the world witnessed the Norwegian train, big early adopters of the Super Sapiens technology, really do some outstanding things further in the sport. So you must be tired, to say the least.
Yeah, it's been an interesting week, definitely. A long travel, but I'd say also the possibility to meet with athletes in person and to see them race in person, and also to meet with our age group athletes that we had in the field was really, really worth it. So definitely an interesting week, a hard one, but hopefully we get a lot of good data from it in the future.
The record for the course, the run record, was obviously set there by Gustav Iden. And you, as a team, having partnered with Olav Alexander Boo and the program for really so many years, it must have been a real sense of satisfaction in some ways, a good hat nod to the fact that this data can be very meaningful for athletes seeking their best performance.
Yeah, well, both Gustav and Christian and also other athletes that we had there did really some amazing things. and their performance is absolutely outstanding. So what they achieved this year and the results that they achieved this year is absolutely insane. I mean, while we were watching the race, we couldn't believe what was the provision of the finishing time. So it was really, really great to witness it in person. And the conditions were really hard. I know that Kona is never easy, to be honest, but I think that this year, and also from the feedback that we got from our athletes, was really, really hard. We also got some female athletes, pro athletes, that were there, and they also said that for them, which were racing like 2 days prior to the men's race, that it was one of the hardest Kona that they did. So to be honest, seeing it in person and seeing the whole environment, also seeing the positive part of that environment, the public and the whole organization, I'd say that they did really an amazing race and outstanding performance.
Yeah. I mean, the ambient conditions can never be controlled for, but that's the account that I've had from athletes and patients of mine, physio patients who raced. It was just incredibly difficult because of the typical heat, but it was just really challenging. Kristina, your role there at Super Sapiens, can you give a very brief little insight into a week in your life there at Super Sapiens as an exercise physiologist? And I believe you're also doing a PhD in sports medicine.
Yeah, so at the moment finishing a PhD, but my original background is a PhD in sports medicine. My original background is in sports science. And in Super Sapiens, I'm overseeing the lab and field research and giving support to elite partners, athletes, team, or some specific project that Super Sapiens wants to be a part of. So this is mainly what I'm doing, part of the really great science team that's behind a lot of concepts that we're developing in Super Sapiens.
Yeah, and gosh, Super Sapiens partnered up with so many incredible athletes, as we've already mentioned, reference to on the triathlon side, Christian Blumenfeld and Gustav Iden. But then across the professional cycling peloton and beyond, there'd be a lot for you to manage. We featured Kristina, Phil Sutherland, the CEO of Super Sapiens, on episode 344, and Phil gave the listenership of the show a good insight into the story behind the brand and the technology. But we felt it would be helpful to also get across the science of the technology a little more and how the science can be applied to athletes out there looking to perform at their physical best, whether they're recreationally competitive, or obviously all the way through the elite. So as an exercise physiologist, what gets you excited about this technology? How do you see it helping athletes perform at their best?
Well, to be honest, the most interesting and the hardest thing about it is the fact that it's so new and it hasn't been used in this way with athletes prior to let's say this period. So it's a technology that already exists for many years, normally used in the world of diabetes, as probably you heard by Phil. But then now it gets a completely another angle of application in the world of sports. We started off with professional athletes, but it is a device that can be used with any kind of athletes, just for different purposes. So it can be used from a side of complete beginner, but also it can be used from a professional, well-developed athlete. The only thing is that their goals performance-wise are going to be different, and therefore the use of it is going to be different too. But something that it's really challenging for us is that it's a completely new technology. So we do see a huge potential in it, but as everything that's new and revolutionary, we're having some struggles in fully understanding how can we make the best use of it by making it the most practical for the user itself, because it's not a super easy device to use, and that's something that I must admit. But what is really positive about it is that it is a continuous learning process on a daily basis, which is insanely useful for any kind of athlete. And what is awesome about it is that it's a device that you have with you for 2 weeks, 24 hours per day, and it basically tracks everything in terms of glucose 24 hours per day. So that's why it makes it different from many other wearables that we have, because it does give you an overall kind of picture of your whole day during different activities, as a reaction to different food, as a reaction to different mood states, and just resting and training both in the same time. So that's quite interesting, to be honest, and it can be a game changer definitely for an athlete.
And Kristina, the app, the Super Sapiens app, which obviously syncs with the sensor, as you mentioned, will stick on the back, the black disc that we're all seeing on the back of the triceps, lasts for 2 weeks, and is continuously monitoring the blood glucose levels across that fortnight period.
Exactly. So it's monitoring the interstitial fluid concentration of glucose. So it's not actually blood, but it's in the interstitial fluid. And it gives you a continuous minute-by-minute data. So the interesting thing about it is that no scans are needed unless you actually leave your phone, or you're distant from your phone for a certain amount of hours. But even in that case, the sensor has a memory of 8 hours. So once you come back, you can actually scan it and have all of your data there. The good thing about the visibility of the data itself is that it's minute by minute. And it's basically live data. So what is super cool about it is that whatever you do, regardless of if that's some food decision you make, exercise, or just a stressful situation, or if you want to analyze your sleep, for instance, you can see immediately the consequences of the choices that you made, which is super cool. We saw that a lot of athletes actually do change their behavior in a positive way, because they have this live visibility of the data and this immediate biofeedback that the application can give you. So I would say that these are the biggest strength of it. We often get questions like, what are the general guidelines and similar things? But to be honest, of course, there are some general guidelines that regard exercise physiology. But what we really can't stress enough is that the device gives you an insight of your individual data. So that's also the main strength of it. I can understand how my body works in terms of glucose by having my own sensor, by having my own access to the data, and that's the most important thing around it.
And in terms of metrics measured, the glucose is reported in milligrams per deciliter, with a reference range of between 55 and 200 or thereabouts. Super Sapiens talks about off hours, on hours, and the glucose performance zone. Can you paint a little bit of a picture around what those phrases mean, or those zones mean?
So first of all, the range is exactly as you said, from 55 to 200. So this means that if it goes below or above this range, the sensor won't show you the numbers, the exact numbers. And this is because it is not a medical device. It's intended to use on healthy athletes. And then about these other metrics, so what we're dividing all the activities in basically as a company is, okay, so we have on hours and off hours. On hours are normally any kind of exercising, which can go from a variety of aerobic exercises to anaerobic exercises, strength training, yoga, even stretching. So anything that's regarding any kind of physical activity. And then we have the off hours, which is everything else. In the off hours, what is the most important thing is to basically maintain the glucose, of course, as stable as possible, to avoid rushes and to avoid drops, because all of these things actually find their foundation in the scientific literature as the best thing to enhance athletes' recovery, which is the most important thing that we're working on. And then during on hours, we're seeing some really cool data around the exercise stability and the performance outcomes. So these are also the ongoing studies that we actually still need to publish, but again, there is a lot of foundation in the scientific literature around it. So that's why mainly we divided these two things completely. Of course, they're not divided by a precise line, because how you recover is going to impact your performance, and how hard was the training or how hard was that performance is going to change your subsequent recovery. So they're connected between themselves, but the app is quite interactive and gives you a lot of feedback and a lot of info around what would be the optimal solution for different kinds of performance and the recovery hours. Regardless to all of that, what is also important is to try to understand the metrics really well. So one of the factors that you mentioned is also the glucose performance zone, which you get it by default in your app, but it's something that actually every user should adapt to its own training type, training duration, and of course their general glucose response, because what's going to be a glucose response during a certain type of training for me, it's going to be completely different for you. So what we often remind our users is to actually change it in terms of which kind of training I need to do and how does my body react to that kind of training.
Change it as in change the training stimulus, or is that what you're referring to, or change the fueling?
Yeah, literally you can change the range of the glucose performance zone in your app. So it gives you the possibility to adapt it to your training and fueling. Of course, you know that you're going to see different numbers or levels of glucose at different intensity training. So if that's a threshold intensity training, it's going to be completely different from, let's say, recovery training. So consequently, you should also adapt the glucose performance zone to different kinds of training and, of course, therefore fueling too.
So it needs to be manually adjusted based on the understanding of the numbers that an athlete's getting over time.
Yes. So what you can do is, or to leave it default as it is, but that's a quite wide range and we're all different. Some athletes actually change it between the easy and the hard trainings, and some athletes literally adjust it every training. So it kind of gets to individual choices of athlete itself. The
rationale is if an athlete can, and their team, their coach, whoever may be involved, an exercise physiologist, for example, like yourself, if over time the athlete can identify their best performance, it can be cross-referenced against what their blood glucose level was like during that time.
Yeah. So what we do normally with any level of athletes that we're collaborating with is that we always advise them to first experiment a bit, because it takes a week or so to understand what are my glucose levels in which points of the day, what causes my body to go out of that 70 to 80 to 140 zone, which is let's say the most optimal for the off hours, and what is the number and the ideal stability at which I perform with. Of course, this is something that needs cross-linking with the training data and of course athlete's feeling. So in an ideal case, you have an athlete that reports really good training. We do see that also in the training load data. And then you also see a really nice stability in terms of glucose. So this is like the most ideal situation in which once you have this info, you can actually try to replicate as much as possible of that in the future.
One of the, I guess, taglines, Kristina, of Super Sapiens is about preventing the bonk. I know Phil encouraged anyone that was going to try the device, which numerous listeners did reach out and said, thank you for the information. We're trialing the device. He said, pop it on for your next race. Even if you don't understand the numbers yet, capture the data. How many events or races would an athlete, is there a minimum threshold of events, the data set of events that you need to be able to start to get an understanding of their ideal glucose performance zone? How is that figured out? Like, to
be honest, already like with the onboarding app that you have with the onboarding guide that you have in the app, you already get really enough insights in the first 10 days to 2 weeks, so the first sensor. So this is already enough to understand quite a lot of things, I'd say. Then, of course, the racing setting is completely different. So we have a lot of athletes, to be honest, even professional ones, that after just a single race actually have a good idea of what worked for them and what didn't. But what we really want to stress with our athletes is to try as much as possible their fueling strategy to seek the stability in the training itself prior to the race. So the race is the best data that you can have because it's the most realistic data needed for the athlete itself. But ideally, you already have everything set for the race itself because you experimented it in the training. And that's the coolest part around it. And to be honest, one sensor is quite enough to get a lot of infos back.
Okay, so 1-2 week sensor. And you use the word, Kristina, stability. So that's, in loose terms, the goal of the performance to have stable blood glucose levels.
Yes, so avoiding the drops, avoiding the rushes. It's not that we can't say that having X amount of drops or X amount of rushes is that much bad or that much good, but higher stability normally is connected with better performance and better feeling and perception outcomes from arriving directly from the athlete. So that's something that's really interesting. That's why stability is one of the main metrics also in the Super Sapiens app itself.
That was interesting. Higher stability is correlated with better performance. Maybe think of Kona, which we already prefaced in this conversation. Is there any insights been garnered from the role or the correlation or the potential relationship between stability of blood glucose and tolerance to heat?
Yeah, that's what we're just analyzing literally in this week. Just before connecting with you, I
had no idea, Chris.
No, but that's really interesting because you said it. We did a small research study with a group of amazing age group athletes that decided to participate in the study. Plus, we had our pro athletes. So we already mentioned the pro males field, but we also had Lisa Norden and Sky Munch in the top 10 in Kona in the female field. So we did do a proper field research study there in order to see how their stability correlates with their nutritional strategy throughout the race, because every single one of them, of course, had different needs, different fueling strategy, and also had a different preparation to get to Kona. And the second goal is to give some practical insights to these athletes, starting from their glucose response throughout the race, and to see in general how they actually performed. So we did actually put in place such a study. We can assume some things around the heat conditions, but to be honest, if we didn't measure directly the impact of the heat conditions to the body, we don't like to speculate too much around it in this case. The only thing that we can actually use is the feedback from the athletes, because some of them really wrote us a nice race report. And when you see the data, first of all, we analyze the data in an objective way, of course, anonymously, without knowing which athlete is which connected to the data. And then if you mix and match it with their feedback and these two things actually correspond, that's the most beautiful thing that can happen.
Their feedback, Kristina, is in, I felt terrible at this point of the race 2 hours in, or I came good at the 6 hour mark, etc.
Yeah, so we get all sorts of infos. Like this morning, I was just reading a really nice email from the athlete saying, I did my personal best. I think everything was in place. I had no issues with the heat. So that was like the really positive one. And then we also had, I think I literally underfueled. I don't know if you can give me some insights around the data, but I just went off during the run, and I think that I underfueled because also talking with my nutritionist and with my coach, I wasn't sticking to the nutritional plan because it was too hot and I just couldn't function normally in those conditions. So we do have a wide range of infos that we can play with, definitely.
Yeah, so this is all in reference to the glucose performance zone, and for intrigued athletes and practitioners, coaches, the like, listening in, everyone wants to know what fueling is best for the athlete, right? It's a huge area, what substrate utilization should look like. The way I would, from the outside looking in, view this technology, Kristina, is it's a powerful tool to help figure out that equation for each individual athlete, rather than pure performance metrics alone, which are skewed by so many variables, or the perception of effort. It's actually objective data on what's happening with the body's currency for energy, which is glucose.
Yeah, it gives you also an immediate insight of how was the impact of your fueling strategy on your glucose response. Keep in mind that some of our athletes actually really feel big variations in glucose quite a lot. So even in their perception, they can actually feel when these variations go from really high numbers to really low numbers in this case. And in that case, what they normally do is they adapt their nutritional strategy accordingly. So this doesn't mean that some product is not good for you. It may just need a different kind of timing or a different way of taking it throughout the hours inside of that grams per hour that you actually decided to have for the race itself. So it's I think that the biggest impact of it in the athletes is actually the visibility, and what we get as a positive feedback from the nutritionists we're working with is, so we can test different products or different timings or different fueling frequency, and we see what is the best strategy in terms of glucose response that they're seeking in. So I think that that's really, really, really useful for an athlete and his performance team around them.
All with the aim of keeping this level stable. And have you seen any relationship between grams per hour of carbohydrate and an athlete that's trying to train their gut over time to absorb or be able to take on more carbohydrates per hour? Is there a relationship, a tipping point at some point where more is not necessarily better, but because the common belief is that if I could just get more carbohydrate into me every hour, I'd perform better. But are you seeing that, or the Super Sapiens sort of detecting anything there?
So at the moment, no, we can't say that something is too much or it's good or bad in this case, because already we know what are the nutritional guidelines for different kinds of athletes and for different kinds of activities that they're actually performing. So athletes already come with their nutritional strategy on place, regardless of what's going to be the glucose response in that case. The only thing that we can actually control there is the stability of it. But saying it was too much, it's hard at the moment, and we can't do that at the moment. Of course, if there is a progressive drop in glucose, or there is a drop without an athlete being able to recover afterwards or go back to baseline, then there is a completely different story. But to say, okay, this is a bit too much, we can't do that at the moment.
Okay. Kristina, with the off-hours monitoring, you mentioned that the aim here is to optimize recovery, which it's a well-grooved adage on this show that the only training we benefit from is the training that we recover from, courtesy of Shona Halson, internationally regarded recovery scientist. With the enhancing recovery, is the assumption that, once again, if there's stability in the blood glucose, that's better, or in the interstitial glucose, it's better? Or is it just that an athlete may recover better if they've got a higher concentration or level? What signposts are there, or what knowledge is there around the relationship between blood glucose levels and the recovery ability of the athlete?
So we do know that there are reference values that are kind of better than the others in terms of those off hours, and that's also something that an app can visually give you immediately as a feedback. So you do see the, let's call it a perfect zone in which you should stay, but also what is really important to underline is that it's not bad or it's not normal if you go out of that zone. I mean, every single one of us is completely different. So even if you get out of below that zone, nothing's going to happen in that moment, and it's not going to immediately impair your recovery. Of course, the goal over time is to stay in the zone as much as possible, maintain the stability as much as possible, because we do know that there are some mechanisms on a cellular level that are going to be impaired if we have a higher variability. But on the other hand, again, what is really important to know is that, and the question that we get a lot from athletes is my glucose normal? Is this situation normal, or similar things? So it's all normal. We all have different individual responses. Going slightly above that zone or slightly below that zone multiple times throughout the day, of course, is normal, because that's how our body functions. But just to avoid some things or to change some behaviors, make some better decisions around the pre-training fueling and post-training fueling is the most important thing that we can work on. But definitely, we don't need to focus on just restricting any athlete to stay in that zone and everything around, like below or above it is bad, because it's not. It's just a normal way that body works.
Yeah, I think that's nice to hear, with most, particularly endurance athletes, typically being quite high fans of data and often quite type A in personality. We definitely don't want to cause another stress around monitoring something beyond normal physiology. On that physiology, Kristina, is it possible for you to do a very brief Physiology 101 review to remind the listenership on just how food is even converted into energy around, the liver glycogen stores, the muscle glycogen stores, like just a little timeline. We take food in, what happens, and then how do we convert it into energy?
So also something that's important to mention from the Super Sapiens standpoint is that when athletes use the app itself and they eat, when they're the first time users, they're looking at the app and waiting for what's going to happen next. So it's not that immediate, actually. So you do have this time to response in which you will see the raising glucose. So I think that that's something, an important angle for any kind of Super Sapiens user. So from the moment that you actually, of course, different kinds of food will have different kinds of impact on our body. So also different macronutrients will have different kinds of impact in terms of glucose response, and some mixes of macronutrients in a different way can actually blunt the glucose response. So that's also something that we have a lot on our blog for the athletes. Normally athletes focus a lot on carbohydrates, let's just say general carbohydrates, without going too much into different details. So the moment when they're going to see something happening on their glucose monitor is going to be different for everybody, and it's going to depend on in which situation you find yourself in. So is that if you're resting or you're performing or what you're doing? But let's say in a complete resting situation, it's not going to happen immediately. It will happen over time. And then the nutrition that you're using, we always need to analyze if it's what is the point of that food that I'm taking in? Is that the most specific recovery meal? Is it the goal to replenish my glycogen stores after the training as soon as possible? Is it to support my performance throughout the training itself? So these are all factors that kind of vary quite a lot in terms of glucose response and in terms of what are you going to see in your Super Sapiens app. What is important to underline is that, yes, glycogen replenishment is really important for athletes. So that's why a different mixture of macronutrients is extremely important. And also, depending on the exercise activity and type at which you're performing at, your fueling strategy needs to be quite different. So it's not going to be the same for zone 1 training, zone 2 training. It's not going to be different for a really long training or for threshold intensity workouts. And that's kind of the main topics that we're talking about when we're talking about glucose response and in general fueling itself.
Thank you, Kristina, for sharing. Where do you see the future of continuous blood glucose monitoring going with regards to performance? If you had a crystal ball, where would you see things in 5 years from now?
Well, I think it's going to be quite interesting. I see a exponential use of it, to be honest. And what really gives me a lot of hope is a huge amount of positive feedback that we have from athletes of all levels. Exactly because it's something that they can use on a daily basis throughout the whole day, not just during the training itself. So it can be when you see an athlete starting to use their glucose data and mix and match it with their sleeping quality, or you see them using it with their recovery metrics, that's also a huge win for us. So not just in race stability and in training stability, but also when they start using it on a daily basis with everything regarding off hours, that's really a huge success for us. So I do believe that this is going to be a new game changer in the world of sports performance.
Kristina, every guest of the show issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. So what is Kristina's physical challenge going to be to the listener? Can be anything.
I'd say try to input like some kind of physical exercise every day And just remember that it's not just 3 times per week or 4 times per week a hard training or a long training. Just try to change your small daily routine habits, like go for a walk after a meal, or insert any kind of physical activity every day, and try to do something for yourself and for your health every single day, regardless of if that's just moving, exercise, or some good food choices.
Beautiful. Every guest also issues their top tip for optimal performance. What would Kristina's top tip for listeners aiming to pursue their physical best performance be?
So performance is supported by good recovery, I'd say. Sometimes, not sometimes, but always, in my opinion, quality needs to be more important than the quantity itself. So what I see, and what I also got as a feedback from a lot of our athletes in Kona, is that especially when they're performing in some endurance sports, they train a lot, which is completely normal and which is completely expected, but try to see what is a lot and what is enough for your body, which again is quite individual, and always be sure that you have enough of quality training in it in order to be able to evolve in terms of performance.
Yeah, gosh, that's rich advice there, Kristina. Thank you for stopping by the Physical Performance Show, and it's been a big week, as you mentioned. All the best for the team recovering from the successes of the past weekend. And we thank you for your contribution.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're listening to Howard Zisser and Kristina Skroce on this expert edition continuous glucose monitoring for health and performance. Today's episode is brought to you by Polar. Now, between the 21st and the 28th of November, Polar are having their Cyber Weekly Sale. It's the biggest sale of the year for Polar products. You can receive up to 33% off selected GPS sports and fitness watches and heart rate monitors. Jump over to polar.com between the 21st and the 28th of November to secure your world-class heart rate monitor or GPS watch. My favourite, the Polar Pacer Pro. Now, Polar have been busy as per usual. They have also just released a brand new fitness and wellness watch, the Polar Ignite 3. The Ignite 3 is a combination of stylish look and smart tech for sports and wellness, featuring a high-resolution touchscreen, stunning design, best-in-class sleep tracking, and powerful training tools. It's time to start living your life in tune with your body's natural rhythm. Jump over to polar.com to find out more about the Polar Ignite 3 fitness and wellness watch. Support for today's show also comes from Pogo Physio's online telehealth consultations. If you are an endurance athlete struggling with bone, tendon, or joint-related concerns, then rest assured Pogo Physio's online 45-minute consults can be a perfect vehicle to help get you back to your physical best. You can schedule your 45-minute online consultation with myself or any of the Pogo Physio team. Jump over to pogophysio.com.au/telehealth. For now, let's jump back with this week's expert edition, continuous glucose monitoring with Kristina Skroce and Howard Zisser. Howard Zisser, MD, Chief Scientific Officer at Super Sapiens. Thank you for stopping by the Physical Performance Show.
Yeah, you're welcome. Pleasure to meet you.
We recently caught up with your colleague, Kristina, who exercise physiologist there with Super Sapiens, who shared around how continuous glucose monitoring is infiltrating the performance landscape. So endurance sports, which is so heavily, this is the focus of this podcast, the endurance sporting community. Kristina suggested that we also would benefit from getting a medical insight into the role of continuous glucose monitoring, both now and the history of it, from yourself as a doctor. So what's been your background medically, and what led you to Super Sapiens, Howard?
I'm a physician by training. I'm an internist. Many people think I'm an endocrinologist. That's because most of my academic world has been in medical devices around diabetes, sensors, pumps, new types of insulins. I got into this about probably 20 years ago, and I was fortunate enough to work with a wonderful woman by the name of Lois Jovanovic. And she was a researcher here with type 1 diabetes in Santa Barbara. And she really changed the world as far as diabetes in pregnancy, type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes, drugs, devices, et cetera. Was really involved in many things for 40 years. So I got to work closely with her at a place called Sansom Diabetes Research Institute here in Santa Barbara. Small nonprofit research place. And when some of these new devices were coming on the market, some of the companies came to us to really do these really small pilot trials. So we did, in some cases, the very first study of taking these sensors, putting them on people with type 1 diabetes, testing their accuracy, how long do they work, how do they work overnight, how do they work when the glucose is changing rapidly. And really, we're trying to figure out to go from, and I can talk a little bit more about the history of checking glucose and measuring glucose, but going from maybe having 2 readings a day, 3 readings a day, to having 300 readings a day or 1,500 readings a day. So in some of my previous talks, I've talked about, kind of going from almost like a line sketch, a pencil sketch, to color oil painting, to photography, to film, to high def, right? And all of that is really just more information. So if you think you're trying to make decisions on very infrequent measurements, it's very hard for these individuals with type 1 diabetes. All of a sudden, you have this continuous amount of data that's coming in. You can really start making better decisions, both with your care provider and also yourself and your kind of everyday stuff. So we started using that to automate insulin delivery, and we created some artificial pancreas closed-loop systems. The history behind measuring glucose goes back hundreds of years. The name of diabetes mellitus, diabetes means siphon. You see these individuals that are diagnosed and they have what's called polyuria, polydipsia. So they're peeing a lot and they're drinking a lot to replace that urine. And it looks like they have a siphon going, but the mellitus means sweet. And that's because the urine tastes sweet because their blood sugars levels are so high that the sugar gets spilled over into the kidneys and water follows it. So back in the day, physicians actually used to taste the urine to say, well, this is sweet, or they would place it out and ants were attracted to it. It really wasn't until the 1970s, 1980s that you can do the finger stick measurement for diabetes. That, of course, changed things. But really, when we had the data density associated with continuous readings, then we can really take that data and do some creative things.
So it's nice imagery, Howard, from, a photo to film. I think everyone can recognize that continuum. And as you say, it's really just about more data. And the device Super Sapiens now, it's a reading every minute. So,
yeah.
It's much more advanced, the evolution of over time, and definitely a lot nicer from a health perspective than having physicians need to taste urine.
Yeah, it wasn't not a lot of people were signing up for that, but you have to for your patients.
Yeah, absolutely. So no, brilliant. And the bridge to performance, Phil Sutherland, Super Sapiens founder, has shared his take on the history of it and his interest as a diabetic himself and his interest in continuous glucose monitoring on a prior episode. But how have you seen the world of sport and performance collide with something that has historically been a medical device for the care of patients with a medical condition, e.g. diabetes mellitus?
Yeah, well, let me go maybe a little bit back into the history with Phil and myself. So I met Phil in Chicago probably in 2005, 2006, where I had some crazy ideas of making some other medical devices related to diabetes. And someone walked me across the floor and said, you need to meet Phil. And I'm like, I have this idea. And he's like, oh, I've already tried that on myself. And that's when I knew this is someone who has, he's a creative thinker and is willing to kind of, go out on a limb and test things. We actually put sensors on his athletes for, I think at the time it was Team Type 1. And I live in Santa Barbara, and over the hill, we've got some really nice hills, and a lot of people do cycling training camps here. And he did that with his team up in Solvang and Buellton. And I went with some of my staff, and we put sensors on these individuals. They all had type 1 diabetes. And we knew what everybody had in their bottles and when they were drinking it. We wired them up with radios. And again, this is probably 2006, 2007. And then we got in the SAG wagon and we're chasing them with clipboards and trying to figure out, okay, so-and-so, had half a bottle of X at this time. We had power meters, heart rate meters. But the technology of actually gathering that data wasn't really there yet, right? So we were in the valley, in the flats, and it was, and this is what I learned a lot about cycling, is everybody's in a peloton and roaring along the road, and we can communicate with everybody really easily. And then we took a left turn and went into the hills, and I quickly learned that not everybody can climb at the same rate, right? So the peloton got kind of stretched out, and then we kind of lost communication. So we've been trying to kind of get all of these inputs in the diabetes world related to sports going back, 15 years or so. Really hard to do because, Wi-Fi and all the signals and radios, just iPads didn't exist. iPhone didn't exist. So we didn't really have the capacity to do that. And at the same time, I had put continuous glucose monitors on some of my, we had some PhD students at University of California, Santa Barbara in the chemical engineering department. And they didn't have diabetes and their glucose looked completely flat. So for a long time, I thought that if you didn't have diabetes, you had no dynamics to your signal. If you ate, maybe you would go up a little bit, come right back down. If you exercised, might change a little bit. But if you looked at the tracing, it was dead flat. But then Phil started putting some of these sensors on people without diabetes that were serious athletes, and their readings were not flat, right? So then you start thinking of, you have this device that is giving you information, whether that the reading is low or high. Some people attach meanings to those numbers, like my glucose readings are good or bad. We try not to think of it that way. We try to think of it as information. So if I have somebody with type 1 diabetes, I can use that information to optimize what they want to optimize. And that's probably to lower their blood sugar so they're not having blood sugars in the 300s, 200s, 400s, really high. And at the same time, preventing them from having low blood sugar, which can be dangerous acutely. You can have loss of consciousness, et cetera. And so what are you trying to optimize? So for those individuals, it's really about trying to compress the signal. So not have as much dynamics. So you're going to have fewer highs and fewer lows, make things more stable. Over a long time, that really is helpful as far as preventing complications of diabetes. The next step that happened historically in this area is actually moving this to patients with type 2 diabetes. These are people that may or may not be on insulin. They tend to get it when they're older, maybe related to genetics, obesity, inactivity. And a lot of people thought, well, if you give those people information, well, what are they going to do? They don't have insulin to really drive down their blood sugar. They may be older. They may not understand how to use digital information. They may have some numeracy issues. But it turns out if you give people information and it's their own information and you're giving it to them in real time, they can make changes. So a guy by the name of Bob Vygotsky did a study in patients with type 2, and that's what they found. You give these people information, it's their information, they're getting it in real time, you give them some education around it, and they can modulate their outcomes. And so the next thing we start thinking about is, okay, if we can put this on people that are endurance athletes, I think that was really the first area to look at, because if you know about Heartbreak Hill and the Boston Marathon around mile 20, people hit the wall, and that got into carb loading and the history there. What if we can design a quote unquote fuel gauge so you don't hit that wall, right? It's very kind of simplistic thinking because it's more complicated than that. But if you go back into the academic journals in JAMA, which is a Journal of American Medical Association, 1924, there were some medical students that did just that. They actually checked their blood sugar on the start line and at the finish line of the Boston Marathon. And the descriptions are quite compelling. I wish I had pulled it up, but it's like, stuporous. This one's in shock. They probably did no training. They probably did no fueling. Nike wasn't around yet. So if you think about this being really a new idea, it's not really a new idea. It's just now we have the capacity to measure this in real time. So the question is, what do you do with that? Well, you start giving it to people and, getting feedback from them. How would you use this? What are you training for? What's the frequency of training? What's the intensity of training? What's your time horizon? How old are you? What gender are you? Do you have any medical conditions? All these things kind of figure in, what do you eat? And it's really amazing when you see your own data in real time and you realize beyond some other level of control, if your blood sugar is going super high from your diet, you're doing that to yourself. Now, there may be a time when you do want to push your blood sugar up, right? Because you want to make sure that you're not running out of this fuel. But when you're away from your exercise, off the bike, maybe in the off season, you really can pay attention to your overall nutrition as well. And it really not only is don't really think of it as just for, I'm going to exercise, so I need to look at my data. It's really like, how do I learn about food? And how do I learn about food that's specific for me? So if I eat something, you eat the same thing, we're going to have a different response. And that's because we're different age, different level of fitness. Our genetics are not quite the same. So it allows you to have your individual data in real time. And it's really super cool when you see it, especially when you give it to someone who has never seen it before and they start using it.
Obviously, with there being so much individual variability with the data, is there any, I know Kristina talked about the glucose performance zone, but is there any similar zone for non-training, non-competition times where people, might monitor to stay in a...
Yeah, I can talk about that. I think a lot of this science is new, right? We've only had the capacity to really measure this frequency of data in diabetes for the last 10 plus years. Really to do it in people without diabetes for the last 2 to 3 years, especially at scale. So this is what we're looking at right now is we're looking at our commercial data, and we've got tens of thousands of people that have used it. Well, what does that look like for a population of this age, this gender, this fitness level that are cyclists? Okay, what does it look like for triathletes? What does it look like for marathon runners? What does it look like when they're on season versus off season? So we're trying to just get a feel for that. In general, you probably don't want your blood sugar going much over, 125, 130. If you look at like the American Diabetes Guidelines, they'll allow for blood sugars to go up much closer to, 175, 180 after a meal. But all of those recommendations are based on kind of pre-continuous glucose monitoring history, right? So all of this is coming from the diabetes field. So basically, you don't want it to go up super high when you don't need that glucose. Now, again, if you eat, whatever, you can eat whatever you want, whenever you want. But if you eat something that's pushing your glucose up high every meal, so 4 or 5 times a day, over time, that's not going to be great for you.
In terms of that heightens your risk of type 2 diabetes potentially over time.
Yeah, and also you're just kind of overall metabolic health, right? High levels of glucose are associated with inflammation, metabolic syndrome. Also, the way the body is quite efficient, right? And a lot of this is related to some research done in the 60s on two, and again, I'm pretty sure this is my understanding because I was around in the 60s, but I didn't do the research. A couple of different tribes of Pima Indians. There's one group in the States that live on the reservation. There's another group that lives down in Mexico in the canyons. So the concept of a frugal gene. So if you have a population that over tens of thousands of years live through feast and famine, right? So that can selectively breed for an individual or a group of people that are very efficient at holding on to calories. So you put a group of those individuals in a area where they're not having to expend much energy, and yet they have lots of calories coming in. And then you put another group in an area where they have to expend a lot of energy and they don't have a lot of calories. So the first group actually has the highest level of type 2 diabetes on the planet. The second group has kind of a quote unquote normal level of diabetes. So the body is very efficient, or can be. Again, everybody's different. So if I have excess calories, well, let me back up just a little bit. The reason we don't eat all the time is because the liver and the muscles can store glucose, right? So think of your liver as kind of a glucose bank. And so if you're carb loading, you're pushing glucose into your muscles and pushing it into your liver. But the muscles can only hold so much and the liver can only hold so much. So if you eat more than that, the body is like, well, I got this fuel. Fuel is really important for me for life. I don't want to just let that pass through me. I want to hold on to it. So the body can actually convert glucose into fat and store it as fat. Fat is, again, not good or bad. It's just fat. It's a very efficient way to store calories. It's about a little over 2 times more efficient than carbohydrate to store energy. So the way I think of it in my mind, and again, this is just me speaking out loud, is when you think about, Wagyu beef, or you think about foie gras, well, how do they get that much fat on an individual animal? It's from, finishing them on corn and beer, and it's basically force feeding them calories in the form of carbohydrates. That carbohydrate gets converted into fat. That fat gets stored everywhere, right? If you look at a good piece of Wagyu beef, the fat is in between the muscle fibers. If you're eating foie gras, that's fat that's stored in the liver. Once you start looking at it that way, and you have access to your own information, you can say, well, if I eat plate A, and it's making my blood sugar going up to 160, 180, 200, and it's staying there for a while, that's probably not really good for me. You can make better choices in your food selection. You also can tailor your food selection to your exercise regimen as well. And I think the other interesting thing is that, if you think about weight management or power to weight ratio, the leading indicator is going to be glucose a lot of the time. Say I put on some weight, I'm going to be more insulin resistant. If I eat the same thing, my glucose is going to go up higher for that same thing. If I want to kind of start heading down the opposite direction, if I see I eat something else and my blood sugar doesn't go up as high, that will kind of be on the front edge of kind of weight loss and weight management. Are you following? Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So the data can inform, from a health perspective, better choices around fueling and food. It allows an individual to tailor their fueling to their exercise regime. And then, as you just mentioned there, Howard, it can also help with weight loss, because it's a leading indicator as opposed to a lag indicator, which is the weight on the scales, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say weight management, because some people actually don't want to lose weight; they may want to maintain weight or put some weight on as well. And I think lastly, the other thing that we're trying to find out more information about is recovery.
Yeah.
Right. And this is something I think when, at least looking from a marketing standpoint, a lot of our marketing is around, don't hit the wall, don't hit the wall, don't hit the wall. But I think probably a little bit less obvious, but probably equally as important, is recovery, sleep, mental acuity, prevention of, low blood sugar during the day because you train, overtraining, I guess is another way to put it. And I think we also need to be very careful not to make exact parallels between the diabetes world and the non-diabetic world. If you have someone with diabetes and they have medications, either oral medications or injectable medications that are driving their glucose low, and they have a low blood sugar, that's going to be very different than someone who is on no medication, but maybe they're under fueling and overtraining. Their blood sugar may remain low during the day, which has different consequences, but they're not the same thing. And this is what we're trying to figure out, what do we call that, right? Because it's not the same thing where you're, call 911, call an ambulance because this blood sugar is low. It's not that. So they're different things. So we have to be very careful about that.
That's a great point. And it's something as a sports physio that I mentioned intrigues me about the device, or about, the function of continuous glucose monitoring, is working with endurance athletes with bone stress injuries, and particularly those with repeat bone stress injuries, where we know that the risk of those injuries can be anywhere between 6 and 15-fold for people or athletes that are in low energy availability states. And if you couple that with low bone density, the risk can go as high as 15 times for your next bone stress injury. So I'm intrigued about the potentials there that technology like this may offer for athletes who are caught in a boom-bust cycle of repeat bone stress injuries.
Yeah, I mean, we do find people that are, under fueling, and these are things that, what was I listening to? I think it was a Strava podcast, maybe about a year ago. Professional cyclist, I think he was getting ready to retire or retired, but he said when he first started, it was all about cutting weight and how light can he be, and he just was burning up too much energy and not replacing that, and just kind of tearing himself apart. And so that's one. And, we see people that, you talk about, what do I eat during an event? And there's, it's between 45 and 90 grams of carbohydrate an hour for long endurance events. It's like, well, is that 45 or is that 90, right? That's 2x right there. And then you say, well, where does this data come from? And it's probably an old study, average of populations. Like, we gave the sensors to, he's actually a medical student in Ohio. He's doing great on triathletes and Ironmans. And he's like, no, for me, it's 115 grams. For someone else, it might be 60 grams, because all of this is individualized. And this is what, once you get the data, this is what we have to help people figure out. And that's what we're working on. I mean, if you go back 20 years when there were power meters on a bike, who thought that everybody would have a power meter on the bike? Well, probably not a lot of people, and the first time you put a power meter on your bike, it's like, oh, that's super cool. Let me see how many watts I can put out. Let me see what happens at, what's my FTP. But just having a power meter on the bike is not going to make you stronger, right? You need to figure out, well, how do I use this? Yeah. Right. So you're not always, I need to be going at, and I wish I could, but I don't know if I'll ever get there, 500 watts all the time. Well, that's not sustainable. And it's also individualized, right? If someone comes up with a training plan for me, it's going to be very different for you, both, as I mentioned, because of age and fitness and whatever. And also, maybe my goals are completely different than yours. So you start putting these things, you measure, it's like, okay, that's good. What do you want to do with it? What are you trying to do? Oh, well, I just want to learn how to better eat, so I feel better through the day, and I want to make sure my blood sugar is not going too high or too low overnight, so I'm not going to do late night snacking, or I don't want to go low in the middle of the night, so I need to add a little bit of fat to my evening meal because I had a really big workout today. So these are things that the only way to do this is actually to get the data and start looking at it.
Just start collecting the data. Step one. Howard, thank you for some of the insights there from your medical perspective with this monitoring tool, essentially, and obviously the technology, Super Sapiens. And what are you most excited about the future of CGM?
I can go in so many different directions for that, and I probably won't choose to, but I could see this being used in so many different areas, right? When I put this on literally the first patient and we started getting data and the data was accurate, it really changed. It's changed my life in many ways. One is the direction of my research. These artificial pancreas systems that we help design are coming on the market now. So I will see somebody when I'm traveling that is using something that I helped develop. My fingerprints are on. And at the time, that's, we had our blinders on. It's like, oh, that's awesome. This is great. And nobody really, there were a few people that kind of zoomed, okay, well, who else can we use it for? So imagine, a trauma surgeon, and they're scrubbed into their case for 10 hours or 8 hours or 12 hours. and it's kind of a stoic field of surgery, right? I can do it. But, you kind of want your trauma surgeon to be fueled, right? Those are endurance events. So what does that look like? What does it look like for other people that it's really critical to have high level of acuity and mental awareness? I also think eventually, and this is a much longer dream of mine, is to get into the hands of, 15, 16, 17-year-olds. So you can go way upstream as far as prevention of, obesity, hypertension, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, strokes, all these things. So at this time where their frontal lobe is starting to gel a little bit, their grandparents may be starting to have some health information or problems, and you could get to this kind of sweet spot of like, I'm getting ready to, leave the nest. Well, go play with your food and see what choices you should be making for the next 20 or 30 years.
Gosh.
Again, that's a much broader vision. But when I put on the first patient, it was like, oh, this works for you. This is awesome for you. How can we use it for you? And how can we use it for the next person? But I think this type of technology, especially because it's at scale now, the accuracy works pretty good. And you do something and you see an immediate effect. So it's not like, I'm going to have you go to the lab and I'll get your labs drawn and I'll call you next week. You do something, it's right there.
Yeah.
But it's really amazing.
Feels like we're at the start of the initial phase of a glucose monitoring revolution for both health and performance in some ways, Howard.
Yep.
Yeah. Howard, thank you very much for stopping by the Physical Performance Show. We really value your insights and expertise, and we'll monitor this with great interest and as it proliferates amongst the endurance community and beyond.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was my pleasure.
So there you have it, another episode of the Physical Performance Show, and I trust and I know that you enjoyed today's share-ins. What a fascinating space we are in with this technology. Now, today's episode is not a paid advertorial in any way, shape or form for Super Sapiens, but do jump over and follow the Super Sapiens team and device over at Super Sapiens over on Instagram. While there, consider a podsy for the episode that you're enjoying of the Physical Performance Show. You can tag the show in at Physical Performance Show. You can also find myself over on the socials at Brad_beer. If you have any feedback for the show, you can reach me over on the socials at Brad_beer or shoot me an email b.beer@pogophysio.com.au. Massive thanks again to Polar's support. Remember, between the 21st and the 28th of November, you can receive up to 33% off selected GPS, sports and fitness watches and heart rate monitors with their cyber sale. A massive thank you to the patrons of this show for your practical support. If you'd like to support the show, you can do so from just $5 per month. Just jump over to Patreon, search for the Physical Performance Show, and there you can pledge your support. In return, we'll grant you complimentary access to our entire back catalogue of live stream events, including the likes of Dr. Stephen Seiler, Dr. Shona Halson, Rooney McGregor, and most recently, Rory Darkins' Positive Sports Psychology live stream. Big thanks to the great folk who make this show possible each and every week: Daryl Misson, audio engineering; Susan Wilkin, show administration; Matthew Olding, graphic design; Milan Borrow, videography. Do follow the show over on YouTube if you'd like to view video episodes of each release. So until next week, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.